We are talking about how to study the Bible, how to understand the Bible, and specifically we're going to begin looking at the Old Testament. I wonder how you feel about the Old Testament. Is it something that you enjoy reading, or is it something that you find very difficult? There are lots of people, honestly, who are a little frightened by the Old Testament. And if you are one of those people, I certainly can understand why. It is a big book. It is a complicated book. With how long the Old Testament is and how old the Old Testament is and how different the Old Testament seems with all those unfamiliar details in the Old Testament, we certainly can understand someone picking up the Old Testament and asking themselves, what is this book? What is going on? Now that is actually a very important question. You can imagine doing a lot of study, and after you've done a lot of that study, someone comes to you and they ask, what is that thing you're studying all about? And you say, I actually don't know what it's all about. Well, then they'll say, haven't you kind of missed the whole point? So by the end of our time together, over the next couple of video sessions, I want you to have an understanding of what the Old Testament is about. And here's the first step. To know what the Old Testament is about, you have to start by understanding what the Old Testament fundamentally is. There are different kinds of books out there. You might have a book of quotes, or you might have a comic book, or you might have a cookbook. And because we're familiar with those different kinds of books, it's not very complicated when we pick one of them up. But imagine if you weren't. If you picked up a cookbook and you didn't know what a cookbook was, and you read a list of ingredients, you would be wondering what is going on until you understand what kind of book it is. Oh, this is a cookbook. Now I see what I'm supposed to do with this. And the same is true with the Bible. To understand the Bible, and specifically the Old Testament, you have to understand what it is. The problem is, of course, that a lot of different people have a lot of different ideas about what the Old Testament is. I remember not too long ago going on a hike up a mountain. And while I was hiking on this mountain, there was a group of people who were shouting out quotes from the Old Testament. And they were just screaming those quotes from the Old Testament as loudly as they could. And the reason they were doing that was because they thought of the Old Testament as kind of a magic book. If you can say these phrases from the Old Testament loudly enough, those phrases in and of themselves, whether or not you understand the meaning or not, have power. I remember reading a book, I think it was called The Year of Living Biblically or something, and it really wasn't living biblically, but the idea was to take the Old Testament and try to keep all the specific laws for a year. And that person was treating the Old Testament as if it were primarily a rule book. Others I've heard of who when they read the Old Testament, it's almost like they just open it up and they look for a verse that inspires them, and so they look to the Old Testament as an inspirational book. Sometimes you'll hear preachers quoting statements from the Old Testament, ripped from their context, of course, but they're quoting statements from the Old Testament. If you do this, then you will be prosperous. And so they look to the Old Testament almost as a how-to book. Well, the Old Testament has laws, of course, and it has rules, and it has encouraging quotes, and it shares wisdom about how to live life, and it certainly is powerful when you understand its meaning, at least. Fundamentally, the Old Testament is more than any of those things. Those are all inadequate ways of looking at the Old Testament. The Old Testament, fundamentally, what is it? The Old Testament fundamentally is a story. Now, obviously, it's not just any kind of story. It's a true story. And it's a specific kind of true story. And we have to say that because the word story can mean different things to different people. For example, when I looked up the word story in the dictionary, these are a couple of the things it said. It said A story is an account of a real or imaginary people told for entertainment. Another definition of a story, a piece of gossip or a rumor. And obviously the Bible is not a story like that at all. When we say story, we mean something more like history, though that word is a little too small. It's a big story. It's the most important story. It's God's story. It's a true story. But it's a story, meaning it has a beginning and it has an ending, or at least it points to an ending. It has a plot. For example, if you go to the very first sentence of the Old Testament, what does it say? The very first sentence says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." That's how you begin a story, an epic story. And it's got an ending. The ending of the Old Testament is actually given in the New, we know that, but you get previews of the end of the story in the Old Testament. For example, Isaiah chapter 66, verses 22 through 24. What does this passage say? How does it describe the end? It says, "For as the new heavens and the new earth that I make shall remain before me, says the Lord, so shall your offspring and your name remain. From new moon to new moon, and from Sabbath to Sabbath, all flesh shall come to worship before me, declares the Lord. And they shall go out and look on the dead bodies of the men who have rebelled against me. For their worm shall not die, their fire shall not be quenched, and they shall be an abhorrence to all flesh." What an ending. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Isaiah talks about the new heavens and the new earth that God is going to make, where it's perfect and where he casts out all the wicked. In other words, what I'm saying is the Old Testament is not just a bunch of random details and facts and quotes and ideas. As we read the Old Testament, we see where things start, we see where things are supposed to go, we see where things went wrong, and we learn what God's doing to fix it. I mean, this is a huge story. It's definitely not a simple story. It tells the story of the universe from the beginning to the end. So it's a long story, and it has all kinds of different characters. So it's a big story, and there's a lot we need to understand in order to understand this story, which is why sometimes reading the Old Testament, it's almost like God puts the story on pause, actually. Have you ever noticed that? You're reading Genesis story, you're reading the beginning of Exodus story, then pause, Leviticus, and God is pausing the story in order to give us all the information we need to understand the rest of the story. All these laws and rituals and sacrifices are somehow coming together to help us understand this one big, huge story about God and about the universe and about why everything exists and about where everything is headed. And that means if you are going to get anything from the Old Testament, you're going to have to understand what the story is basically about. It's a little like going to a movie and you come home and someone asks you to tell them about the movie that you saw, and you just tell them a bunch of details. You say that the main character wore black and he dressed up like an animal and he had a cousin and the cousin had all these strange tattoos. What are they going to say when you're done? They're going to say, "That's not helpful. What was the movie about?" Or if they ask, "What movie did you see? What was it about?" And you start quoting random lines like, "My son, it is your time," or "Guns, so primitive." They'll have no idea what you mean, because those lines, no matter how many you quote or how loudly you quote them, aren't going to help them by themselves, just like the details don't help by themselves. Because to understand the lines or the details, you have to know what first? You have to know the story. One of the best illustrations I've heard is of a photo mosaic. You know what a photo mosaic is? It's a collection of various pictures, individual pictures. So you have all these individual pictures and they're grouped together. And if you look at the individual pictures by themselves, you're like, what is this? There's a picture of you at a picnic, a picture of a dog, and you can imagine all these individual pictures, and yet all of those individual pictures are brought together so that when you step back, you see the bigger picture, which is how the Old Testament works as well. God's bringing together all these individual pictures to show us one big picture of what he's doing in this world, which means we need to be able to answer, what is this story about? Now, there are a couple different ways we could do that. One way we could summarize the story of the Old Testament is just to say it's a story about God. It's fitting, I think, that it begins, in the beginning God, not in the beginning man. Because the Old Testament is ultimately about the greatness of God, and there are some who even describe it as the biography of God. Though it probably would be better, since he's ultimately the author, to call it the autobiography of God. And one reason God wrote a book about himself is so that we could see how beautiful he is, which is important because we can be pretty selfish. And so in general, the person that we're most interested in most of the time is ourselves. It's kind of funny or sad, really, because, we live in a big universe with a lot of amazing things. And yet, with how big this universe is and how amazing everything in it is and all the stuff that's happening is, while there's lots to think about, the person most of us are most interested in hearing about and talking about is ourselves. And if that's true of us, that's going to seriously mess up our reading of the Old Testament if we read it as if it were first and foremost about us, because while it has stuff to say about us, the Old Testament is first and foremost about God. You might say that's its purpose. It's about the glory of God. The story the Old Testament tells is about glorifying God. If you're reading the Old Testament and you're growing more and more amazed by the greatness of God, you're on the right track. That's the reason for the Old Testament. Though I suppose if you wanted to get a little more specific, another way you could summarize the Old Testament is to say that it's especially designed by God to get us ready for Jesus. What God is doing through Jesus is so important that he takes thousands and thousands of years and all kinds of pages in our Bible to get us ready to understand it. It's kind of like if I want to teach you algebra. That's an advanced subject. And if I'm going to teach you algebra, I have to teach you all the fundamentals of math to get you ready for it. In the Old Testament story, God's laying the groundwork so we can appreciate what he's doing through Jesus. In Luke 24, Luke actually tells us that. After his resurrection, Jesus was walking with a couple of his followers who couldn't recognize him, and so he took them back to the Old Testament, and beginning with Moses and all the prophets, Luke says, Jesus interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. We call the New Testament new as if it were something completely different from the Old Testament, but it's amazing how much of the New Testament is the Old Testament. Something like 10% of the New Testament is either a quote or a direct allusion to the Old Testament, and that's because one of the primary things the New Testament writers were doing was trying to help people see Jesus there. So if you want to summarize the Old Testament, you might say it's about God, or you might get more specific and say it's about God revealing what he's going to do through Jesus. But there's at least one more way you might summarize the Old Testament, and it's the way Jesus most often did, which we'll talk about in our next class.